Wild, and today we are in St. Louis. This is Kilo Sierra Tango Lima, and we're going to be taking a flight over to Pittsburg, which is Kilo Papa India Tango. This is a flight that was requested by a subscriber, Mark. Not sure why these two airports, but he requested a flight between these two airports using the Zibo model 737. This is the latest model as of this morning. As any of you who fly this model know, it changes often. It's been a while since I've been in it, so I'm going to have my checklist handy. But as always with my videos, we start out with some planning. So here is our route that is projected on a VFR sectional, flying from St. Louis just across the southern edge of Indianapolis, over the northern edge of Columbus, and then into Pittsburgh. Let's take a look at our high altitude chart. Nothing here sticks out. We will not be using a jetway, and you'll see why in a minute. It's pretty much a direct flight between waypoints. So what are the pros doing? Let's go over to FlightAware.com. I've plugged in the route and it pulled up the Southwest flight. And the thing I'm interested in here is the route. So we've got a SID of JHeart 6 to a transition of Creep and another transition of Charlie Tango Whiskey. This is a VOR because of the 3 letters. And then the star of Fuga 4. So my next stop is SimBrief.com. I plugged in all the information as a confirmation, and it gave me the same route that the Southwest flight took. It gives me my times, suggested cruise altitude, some weights that I'll want to pay attention to, and it plots the route. Notice this little dog leg here. You'll see how that works in a few minutes. And before I go down to winds aloft, just check our fuel. So we want fuel of 7,500 kilograms. My reserves are going to be 2,200. My cost index is 50. Now scrolling down to winds aloft, at top of descent, I'm going to have 197 at 12 knots. Actually pretty light for that altitude, and then outside temperature of 08. So let's head back to SkyVector first and check our weather. So we've got winds out of the northwest, 340 at 8 knots, and our altimeter is 2993. Over in Pittsburgh, the wind is from another direction, 120 at 14, gusts to 21 knots, and our altimeter is 30.11. So let's take a look at our SIDs and stars and our final approach plate into Pittsburgh. So here is our SID, or our RNAV departure. One of the ways I can tell it's an RNAV departure, the existence of these 4-point stars. You won't see them on a traditional SID or star. If you want to see the difference between an RNAV departure and a non-RNAV departure, the main difference is that I don't have any direct navigation from the runway to the beginning of the SID, where here I have very exact navigation that gets me oriented and on my way. So here is our star, or approach to Pittsburgh. We're going to be transitioning at the VOR Charlie Tango Whiskey. We fly direct to another VOR Alpha India Romeo. At that point we head to the northeast to Fuga, and then we make a left turn and head in a northern direction, and what this does is get us set up for our approach to the east. By the way, you'll notice a circle around this RNAV waypoint, And this means it's a flyover. So we have to actually fly over the waypoint before making our turn. The traditional waypoint would have us turn before. Notice there are two other branches. One gets us set up for a landing to the northwest, and one gets us set up for a landing to the west. Now if you go down to the instructions, and by the way, I always recommend this, if we are landing on 10 right from Fuga on track 002, expect radar vectors. Well, I'm not using ATC, so I'm going to find a couple of waypoints that I can program into the FMC that will get me lined up on my final approach. So we're all planned back in the cockpit. Hopefully all that planning wasn't too tedious for you. I kind of enjoy it. So let's start here on our iPad with ground services. Notice that our GPU is connected. Then I head over to fuel, and remember we want 9.9 or 9,900 kilograms of fuel, and our shift CG, we make this minus 21. I really don't have a good explanation of why we use that number, but we want these to be in the 18 range. And head back to our home screen. So next is configure and customize. We'll check our hardware. I want this to be on roll because I don't have any sort of pedals. Then realism. I have an align time set to short. Let's leave it there and get things powered up. Alright, starting with the overhead panel, we want to turn on our battery. We'll guard it. These switches, we need to check that they are on. We can go down to our ground power now and turn that on. Once we have some power at our disposal, we can turn on some lights to let folks know things are happening here. My friend Steve always likes to have the logo light on. And if we need to, we can turn up our backlighting. Don't really need it right now. Then after we get the power going and the lights turned on, we can go up to our IRS and get that aligned. Just click it over to nav. Whoops. And you'll see align in both, and we just have a minute to align. Remember, I had it set for short in my configuration. So let's just work our way across this panel. We can just move down this way. We want emergency lights on. We can leave our seat belts on auto, that's fine. And then moving down this panel, we're not going to do anything with it just yet. On this side we'll go with trim air and turn on our packs to auto. We'll leave the rest of it there. We will be dialing in our altitude for our oxygen shortly. Once we get all that set, then we can head down to our FMS and get that programmed. So let's turn on some lights here. This is all backlighting that is necessary at some point. Now there's a way you can use your trackpad, but for some reason I zoom in, so I find it better if I just do it manually. And let's just check the back door. I want to get that closed, and you'll see that the lock light is extinguished, and we can Also get some lighting on our center console. Now back to our FMS, and let's start with FMC. And here's where we put in our airport. Whoops, want to clear that first. So K. And then we go to this next page. We select this GPS L. That would be fine. We put that in our scratch pad. Go back to the previous page and we can punch that in here. Click on route. KSTL is in our scratch pad. We add that using the L1 button. Then our destination is going to be Pittsburg. And then we need to put in our fuel. It's just a matter of tapping that. You can see the fuel that we put in, 9.9. Our reserves, 2.2. Cost index, if you recall, was 50. And this is just how economical the plane will fly itself. And our cruise altitude, I'm going to go with flight level 320. And then we have our cruise. If you remember, it was 197 at 12. For our winds. And now we want to put in our OAT here on the ground, 27. So 27. Flight level 180 here in the US, and over to our N1 limit. And you can just click that button there. Now notice we have thrust of 99.9, so I can derate the engine by plugging in a number here. I'm just going to go with 40. And it lowered it a little bit. I'm not going to derate my climb. Over to takeoff, flaps of 5. And just click our CG. Here's what we saw on our iPad. And then I simply click these right buttons to plug in our V speeds. So now we're ready to go over to our departure and program that. So let's start with our runway here. You need to go to the next page. We're going to go with 30 right. And our SID is going to be Xairport 6. And here is creep, our transition. So that gets entered, activated. Our arrival screen, and we're going to be using Fuga 4, transitioning at CTW, that VOR, and we're landing on ILS 10 right. And we do not need this VOR. So let's see how we did on our leg screen. We'll just flip through this and look for discontinuities. We have one here between creep and CTW. There is a reason you might want to put in an extra waypoint if there is a long distance between these two. Let's go over and look at our SkyVector chart. So I'm going to put in creep, and we see that right here. And next would be CTW, which is right here. It's 132 nautical miles. It's not great, but we could, if we wanted, include maybe this VOR here, Ape, Appleton. So we can put that into our FMC. So let's do that here. That was APE. Alpha Papa Echo, and we just click it there and fill in those empty boxes, and now our discontinuity is taken care of. Notice we have vector here. I'm going to delete that. Now we've got a discontinuity between Limu and Wiley. Let's see what's going on with that. So here's Limu and here's Wiley. What is the difference between them? Let's plug those in as well. So we've got Limu, W-I-I-L-E, and if you look here, so here's Limu, here's Wiley. We really don't need anything in between there. So I'm good going from Limu to Wiley. We just need to go back to our FMS. Let's just clear out this last discontinuity. So we put Wiley down in the scratch pad and then enter it where our boxes were and execute. Why don't we step through our plan? So we'll flip our little switch here on the FIS, and then we just click the little R6 button, and you'll notice all of our RNAV waypoints, 2 VORs, and finally into Pittsburgh. So everything looks pretty good. I don't see any issues there. And flip this back to map. So before calling for our pushback, let's just set our baro, which is 93, and it automatically is synced with the co-pilot or first officer's side. I've got my flight director on, I've armed my auto throttle, and I need to put in the correct airspeed for our V2. So back to our FMS, and let's see, take off, and that is 138. So that's when I want to plug in there. And our altitude is going to be flight level 320. And I'm going back to my checklist because I don't want to forget anything. We've got RTO setting for our auto brake. And we've got our door closed, our panels lit up, radios are set, and in our overhead panel we want to turn on our yaw damper and then turn on a fuel pump, and this will be for our APU start. And we come down here and click the start button. Supposed to hold it so we can see it coming up here. Now we can turn on our APU generator and APU bleed. We can turn off our ground power, go back to our iPad and turn that off. And looks like the chocks have been removed, and we can call better pushback at this point. So let's give our tow operator a plan. Doesn't have to be too exotic here, just a small turn. Get us pointed in the right direction. There, that looks pretty good.
Plan acknowledged. Call me through the menu when you are ready.
And we are ready.
Ground to cockpit. Tow is driving up.
And a few things we need to finish up on this overhead panel. Turn on our electric and our window heat. We'll save the probes for a minute. Our fuel pumps need to come on. We can set this for flight level 320. This is our oxygen. So plug that in. So that is set. And before we start, we're going to turn our packs off. So as soon as we get the OK from our pushback, we'll do that.
Tow connected and bypass pin in service. Release parking brake.
So release the brake.
Starting pushback, and you may start engines.
Switch to ground. Watching my N1 waiting to 25. Then I will add fuel. And start our left engine. Again, waiting until N1 is at 25.
Operation complete. Set parking brake.
Parking brake on.
Disconnecting tow. Stand by.
So now that our engines are running, let's turn on those generators. And we can kill our APU now. But people are dying in the back, so we want to get our air conditioning going. Turn off our APU bleed. And flip this over to Gen 1. Turn on our probes. And now everything seems to be in order on the top panel. We can turn on our taxi light. And then a couple of notches of flaps here. We want 5 degrees. Flip our transponder over to TA before we taxi. So our next task is getting over to 30 right. This is a airport diagram for St. Louis. We are located right here on Lima pad. And we're going to use Delta Hotel Echo to reach our destination here 30 right. I won't bore you with the taxi, and you can join me at the end of runway 30 right. So there are a few tasks to take care of before leaving St. Louis. Let's start with our overhead panel and turn on some lights. Guess we officially don't need the taxi light. And we can turn on our strobe. Probably don't need the logo light on at flight level 320. Everything here is ready to go. Go down to our transponder, turn it on to TARA. Flaps are good. And we are ready to taxi onto the runway. Now normally I would also turn on VNav and RNav before leaving, or arming it I should say, before taking off, but your first waypoint has to be within 5 degrees of the runway heading, which it is not. Start our timer. Do a rolling start here. Toga.
80 knots.
Just watch for those V speeds.
V1, rotate.
Here we go. Don't want to scrape that tail.
Positive rate.
Gear up. And at 400 feet,
400.
Start our navigation. First notch of flaps. So we make our turn, headed towards our first waypoint. And we pick up speed and go to our final notch of flaps, 0. The Mississippi River. Can flip off our turn-off lights, runway turn-off lights. We'll leave on our landing lights until 10,000. And we can relieve our auto brake, turning it to off. Increase the range on our ND here, at least up to 40. And we're at 10,000 feet. We can increase our speed above 250 knots. And now that we've picked up some speed, we are climbing again.
Today's flight and continue earning miles with our retail and travel partners.
Getting above our cloud deck.
Aviator MasterCard is another great way to earn miles.
Probably over Illinois now.
And enjoy benefits.
And well on our way. So join me a little bit later as we get to our top of descent. Remembering at flight level 180, I will flip over our baro to standard by pressing this button here. Flight level 320. Picking up a little speed, almost to Doppler. Passenger view. Central Illinois. Lots of corn. So sit back, relax, enjoy a drink, and join me in a while. We are just south of Indianapolis. Here is the international airport there. Kilo India November Delta. And Indianapolis itself. So this is our SkyVector. So we're right around here. And here's Xairports that has an actual moving icon here, but it's always a little hard to find. In fact, I don't see it. So let me refresh. Well, that's way too close. So there we are. Freaking out here. By the way, if you don't have Xairports, it's like $3, and they've got all kinds of wonderful maps that you can use. Just what you would see on SkyVector, only you get to see where your airplane is. And if you're using the Garmin 430 or 530, it will actually paint a line on the map. I wish it did it based on the FMS and the Zibo, but anyway, it gives you some indication of where you are in space. So here we have creeping up on us, as it were. This is our transition from our SID. Quite a ways to go to transition. And if you'll remember, we had a discontinuity here between creep and CTW, the VOR, which is the transition for the star. So we filled it in with APE. You will often get a discontinuity between two transition points if there is nothing in between. So we added Alpha Papa Echo as a VOR to smooth things out. So where are we in our progress here? We've got 150 miles, nautical miles to our top of descent, and it's showing a time of 41.5 Zulu. So right now we are at 22. So in about 20 minutes we'll need to get ready for our descent. Also notice I've got a fuel light here, which means that our center tank has been extinguished. So we can turn those pumps off. Probably should have done that sooner. It's hard to tell if these things are on or not. So join me again in a few minutes. So as our sun begins to go down and we get into twilight, we have our top of descent ahead of us. According to our FMS, we've got 31 miles to go. It's about 4 minutes. So let's take a look at our star. So we will be using this VOR, Charlie Tango Whiskey, flying down to Alpha India Romeo, and then to our waypoint Fuga, then Lemieux, and shifting over to our approach plate, we will be intercepting, hopefully, if all goes well, our localizer, Willie. And our altitude we want is 4,000 feet. That will help us pick up that elusive glide slope. So we need to set this up. Alright, where was I? Let's dial our altitude down to 4,000 feet. And just sit it out until we see the throttles come back and the nose pitch down. The only thing we'll need to do is monitor our speed. We may be asked for drag. That will appear up here just below our FMA. But other than that, it should be relatively automatic. Passenger view. Kind of strange clouds today. Not very realistic. Surprising because these are SkyMax. And usually they're pretty good. And where are we in relationship to... So you go back to our, you can see our plane here. This is Xairport. So we are a little bit east of Columbus. That's not me. There's nothing wrong. Don't try to adjust your set. We've got Cleveland to the north and Pittsburg just over the border. So we're just waiting for those throttles to come back. Seat belts are on auto, so I assume they're off and will come back on. You can see a tight cluster of waypoints as we get closer. Our star begins at this VOR, CTW. But we'll begin our descent before that, hopefully. And there we go. Throttles are coming back. Nose is pitching down. Descent has begun. And you can see our little altitude arc. And we see drag required. Maybe it's the Airbus where you have it show up here. So let's add some speed brakes. It's interesting, there's really no indication you have speed brakes other than the actual physical knob or lever. Of course, you can look out the window and see that they are up. Now it's already flipped off, so we can go back to maybe one notch. So now that our descent has begun, I will monitor the numbers for you, and then occasionally you can join me as we get closer to our destination. We are approaching our standard transition of flight level 180. I just checked our baro, and it is in Pittsburg. Let me press the center. It's 2988. And you can see that Willie has been designated at an altitude of 4,000 feet. This is our current vertical speed. It's showing destination 38 miles to Willie and an ETA of 56. And we're about ready to turn towards Fuga. So we are making this turn here and up to Fuga. These are all fly-by or fly-around waypoints, but this one, remember, we have to fly over it. And if you look, you can see a very acute angle here. So here's our 4,000 feet. Again, I'm just making sure that drag is not required. And once we hit 10,000 feet, lights will go on, and we want to slow to 250. Starting to pass through the cloud deck. Clouds do look a little bit better when you're closer to them, passing through them. Sun setting in the distance. Lights on down below. Let's check our frequency for our approach. That localizer is 1089, so we can set that up here. And we'll want to put it on both sides. It's best practices. 1089, right? Yep. Just want to double check. And now we're turning towards Lemieux. I think this is Pittsburg off in the distance. So we're up in this area. And this is the Ohio River. So we're below 10,000 feet. Let's turn on our lights. Really no reason for an ILS approach, but why not? Now remember, we removed vectors from our flight plan. Simmers live in a bit of a bubble, especially if you're not using VATSIM or something like Pilot Edge, where we are just flying these, relying solely on our flight plans. Not very realistic. Chances are ATC is going to be giving you instructions and telling you what to do. Drag is required. So speed breaks up. You can see our glide slope active now. And when we make this turn, I will activate our approach. We will be flying under the glide slope, so don't worry. There's our localizer. It's off to our left. So I'll click approach. In a notch of flaps, we are at what they call green dot. 5 degrees. See, we flew over Lemieux before we made our turn. Normally we would go around it to make things a little bit smoother, but for some reason that's how it's set up. Glide slope, localizer, I want to keep an eye on that. We can activate our speed here. Another notch of flaps. Spoilers off. Spoilers armed. And I'm waiting for this to
1,000 to go.
go solid. And swing across. So we will be about 9 miles out. All right, you can see our localizer coming across. We begin to make our turn towards the airport. And once we're established, I'll engage our second autopilot. It's So we turn towards 10 right. And note, we've got green localizer, green glide slope. Speed is being managed. Life is good. Let's turn on that second autopilot. Another notch of flaps. I was hoping we'd get some indication of our distance from the ILS. Let's go with 140 and another notch of flaps. Gear down. This porpoising makes me a little nervous. Kind of bouncing up and down here, but localizer and glide slope are on the money. Just double checking here. So final notch of flaps, autopilot is off, didn't like the bouncing, and auto brake set to max. Yeah, a little bumpy here on approach. So, using my PAPI lights.
1,000 feet stabilized, Mr. Burke.
Although the glide slope bug is still giving me an indication that I'm pretty much right on. So folks, just hand flying this 737, which is okay. I talked to some Southwestern pilots standing at the gate, and they said they still hand fly a lot. So
400.
Try to stay lined up here.
300.
And hopefully I'll get my reverse.
200. 100. 50. 40. 30. 20. 10.
Never got my reverse. So hopefully I can get this thing slowed down. As a friend of mine said, you don't want to practice your grass runway landings. Alright, well that was a little sloppy. Not sure what happened with our reverse. Get off the runway here. Alright, so you got to see Breadwild struggle a little bit. And we'll stop here, gather our wits, clean things up a bit, clean up the flaps here. And we can turn off our lights here, taxi light on, strobe light off. I'm going to turn on my turn off lights just so I have plenty of light. And I'll taxi over to the gate and you can join me in a second. Probably don't need all those lights, do I? People inside are not happy. Yes, much better. And we can fire up our APU. Or let's see if they've got some ground power here. Ground services, yeah. That's better. We don't even need our APU. So that ends a very interesting flight, or at least it had an interesting ending. So this is Breadwild signing off until next time. Please post any questions, comments, criticisms that you have. I'm always open.